Boa noite. A partir de agora você assiste ao programa Espaço Público, o programa de entrevistas da TV Brasil. Hoje nós temos um programa especial com o Prêmio Nobel Joseph Stiglitz. Estamos aqui, eu e Florestan Fernandes, para fazer um programa gravado e, portanto, não haverá participação das redes sociais.
Aos 72 anos de idade, Joseph Stiglitz formou-se em economia pelo Instituto de Tecnologia de Massachusetts. Entre 1995 e 1997, no início do governo de Bill Clinton, ele foi chefe da assessoria econômica da Casa Branca. Adversário dos programas de ajuste e reformas estruturais que marcaram o debate econômico a partir da década de 1980, sua visão crítica da economia de mercado lhe valeu o Prêmio Nobel de Economia em 2001. Professor da Universidade de Columbia, em Nova York, Stiglitz é autor de trabalhos considerados fundamentais sobre a crise mundial do capitalismo, que começou com a quebra dos mercados em 2008, como O Mundo em Queda Livre e O Preço da Desigualdade. Também escreveu um ensaio famoso, do 1% pelo 1% para 1%, que foi apontado como uma das fontes de inspiração dos protestos que marcaram os Estados Unidos no fim da década passada.
Professor, estamos muito felizes de receber o senhor aqui. O senhor é um velho estudioso da América Latina, tem vários países que já esteve, visitou, os seus ensinamentos aqui são sempre muito respeitados. Um ponto que eu gostaria de começar falando é uma frase que eu estava lendo aqui nesse livro do senhor, O Preço da Desigualdade, em que o senhor diz uma frase que me chamou muito a atenção. O senhor falou que nós estamos num mundo em que a coesão de valores está se rompendo, em que a solidariedade social está cada vez mais complicada. E o senhor tem uma frase aqui que eu vou ler para o senhor, que é assim: um sistema básico de valores teria que haver gerado um sentimento de culpa por parte daqueles que se dedicam a fazer empréstimos abusivos, por aqueles que exploram os pobres com hipotecas que são bombas relógios, ou por aqueles que fazem programas que vão permitir que eles ganhem comissões milionárias e sem paralelo. Essa falta de sentimento de culpa, o senhor acha que é um dado muito importante desse momento que a gente vive? Dessa economia cruel? Como é que o senhor vê isso?
Well, I think that one of the striking things about our society today is that so many at the top see their higher income as a result of their just desserts for their own work. One of the presidential candidates in the United States talked about himself as a self-made man. But of course, nobody is self-made. I mean, by definition, you are born. But there's a fundamental problem that all of us benefit from our society. I see people working very, very hard, very bright people in other countries, and they're not very well off. So the only reason that one really can achieve something is because of the society that we're a part, the way the government enforces laws, the benefits that we get from public highways, all these things that we often take for granted, but are essential for the well-being of all of us. And so I think people have to understand there's no such thing as a self-made person. We're all part of a society, and that's why solidarity is so important.
O senhor é um crítico do fundamentalismo de livre mercado. O senhor acha que o sistema financeiro dominou hoje o planeta? Nós estamos hoje na mão desses bancos?
Well, I think that one of the things that's been very clear since the crisis, but was clear even before that, was that free markets on their own are neither efficient nor stable. They took the savings of millions of people and mismanaged it. And the result of that is the whole world suffered. The bankers were an important part of the story, but the failures go deeper. Now, what we're beginning to understand in the United States is that the system has benefited a very few people at the top, but not most of our citizens. So that today, for instance, those in the middle have a lower income than they did 25 years ago. So everybody talks about how successful the American economy has been. But if you ask the average American, they know that there hasn't been an increase in their prosperity for a very long time.
Eu gostaria de perguntar, seguindo nessa linha da desigualdade, que é um dos grandes assuntos desses seus últimos livros, o senhor fala da sociedade de 1% contra 99%. Se a gente for pegar os muito ricos no Brasil, aqueles que têm, assim, 12% da riqueza nacional, é 0,3%. São os que pagam menos impostos, em alguns casos não pagam nenhum imposto. É uma desigualdade brasileira, conhecida, histórica. A pergunta que eu gostaria de fazer para o senhor é: por que é tão difícil tirar dinheiro dos ricos? Por que é tão difícil assim avançar na igualdade? Por que é tão difícil assim? Por exemplo, no Brasil a gente não consegue ter um sistema de impostos mais justo. Por que é tão difícil derrotar, ainda que parcialmente? Por que é tão... De onde vem isso?
This is one of the important points that I raise in my book, that there is a very close connection between economic and political inequality. You know, we like to think of our democracies as one person, one vote. But one of the things I point out, the American democracy, and this is true in other countries, we've become increasingly like $1, one vote. In America, we're very explicit. We allow corporations to make unlimited campaign contributions. And money talks in politics. The result of that is that in the United States, for instance, and this is true in other countries, you know better Brazil data than I do, that the very top pay a lower rate than those lower down. Warren Buffett, who is one of America's wealthiest men, actually said this is wrong, that it is wrong for him to pay a lower tax rate than his secretary. But in spite of the fact that he said that, and he was one of those honest voices calling for reform, we haven't changed things. That it is still the case that somebody speculating on land, who is very wealthy, pays half the tax rate of somebody who works for a living. You know, I testified in Congress not very long ago, and a panel, Republicans, Democrat, Independent, and one of the senators asked me, can you explain to my constituent, my voter in my district, who's a plumber, and he wants to know why should he pay a higher tax rate than somebody speculating on land? And if you speculate on land, you don't get more land. There's no supply benefit. He says, it's unfair. Can you give me an explanation? And none of us could explain it. And yet, Congress doesn't change it. The president doesn't even propose changing this. So,
por quê? Por que é tão difícil? Porque vai criar conflitos que ele não quer enfrentar de jeito nenhum. Como é que é isso?
Well, I think the next presidential candidate on the Democratic Party will propose changing this. I think there is now such a groundswell in the United States saying that this system is unfair. And not only is that unfair, it's distorting our economy. And I see it very strongly. You know, my best students aren't going into teaching, into public service, into research, into all these things, even into business. They're all going into finance, into speculation. And it breaks my heart because they have talents. And the interesting thing is after 20 years, 25 years, they come back and they say, I made a mistake. Money isn't everything.
Essa história é muito parecida com a que ocorre aqui no Brasil, né? Nós temos uma eleição que parece que distorce um pouco a eleição presidencial no Congresso. O presidente é eleito e não consegue fazer maioria no Congresso e fica refém de partidos que fazem negócios na hora de fechar o apoio, né? Nos Estados Unidos, se o Partido Republicano continuar mantendo o controle, o que vai acontecer com a economia do país?
Politics is always complicated, and even the politics within the Republican Party is very complicated. The Speaker of the House couldn't get enough support from his own party that he had to resign. So the Republican Party is very divided. But what worries me is the following. About a third of a century ago, America began an experiment. What we said is, if we lower tax rates on the top, we strip away regulations, the economy would grow faster. Yes, there would be more inequality, but the increase in growth would be so much that even the people in the middle, the people at the bottom would be better off. Well, we now had a third of a century of this experiment, and it has failed. It succeeded in only one thing, creating inequality and making inequality, America, the country in the world among the advanced countries with the highest level of inequality and among the lowest levels of equality of opportunity. Unfortunately, the economy actually grew more slowly than it did in the decades after World War II when we had shared prosperity. And so the result of that is the people in the middle are worse off than they were a quarter century ago. Almost all of the growth that has occurred in a third of a century has gone to the top 10%. At the bottom, the wages at the bottom are lower than they were 60 years ago. Can you imagine 60 years with no increase in the wage at the bottom? Unfortunately, the Republicans are committed to doubling down. That's an American expression meaning double your bet on a failed strategy. Put more money on. So it hasn't worked for a third of a century. The problem is we haven't done enough. And I can tell you from my analysis and what I say in this book, if we do more of that, we're going to get even more inequality and we're going to get lower growth. And the title of my book is The Price of Inequality. And the point I'm trying to make there is we are paying a very high price for this inequality, not only in terms of what you talked about, the divided society, the undermining of social solidarity, but we're also paying a price because we're undermining our democracy, moving to this $1, one vote, but we're also undermining our economy. Our economy is growing more slowly, short-sighted.
É uma ideia muito importante, quer dizer, como a desigualdade prejudica a economia. Isso é uma ideia que as pessoas não gostam de pensar. Os economistas, em geral, gostam de pensar que são outras leis, a economia funciona de outro jeito, você não está entendendo nada, economia é o mercado é outras coisas, tem que fazer umas contas matemáticas. Isso coloca essa questão da desigualdade no centro da discussão, isso não é único. Depois do senhor, o Thomas Piketty, coloca esse problema de uma outra forma, estudando a desigualdade, fazendo coisas assim. E outros economistas, é um fulcro muito importante nesse momento para discutir a economia. Dá para você explicar aonde que a desigualdade atrapalha? Por que a gente cresce menos? Por que tem menos oportunidades numa economia desigual?
First of all, let me point out, this is not a left-wing view. The IMF, which is not a left-wing institution, has said their research shows that countries with more inequality perform more poorly. They grow more slowly, they're more unstable. Now, there are a number of reasons that my research and research of the IMF, research of the OECD have tried to explore. Why is this? There are a couple reasons. One of them is that when you have a lot of inequality, and especially when you have inequality of opportunity, what that means is those at the bottom are not living up to their potential. They're not getting the education that they need. So, in effect, you are misusing, underutilizing your most important resource, your human resource. You're not using it to its potential. And so, of course, you're going to grow more slowly. But there are other reasons. And those are related to the way inequality has been growing in most countries. And that has to do with distortions in the economy, monopoly power, the ability, when corporate CEOs are able to get so much of the corporate income, there's no money left over for investment. And if you don't invest in the economy, you're not going to grow. The financial sector, which has been one of the big sources of inequality, has been taking money out of corporations rather than putting money into corporations. So you get a distortion from this monopoly rent, from these monopolies, which actually slows economic growth. Then you have other problems as well. The financial sector, again, a source of so much inequality, is very short-sighted. And because it's short-sighted, it's not investing in technology, it's not investing in people. And the result of that is the economy doesn't do as well. But there's still one more that I think is particularly important, given the beginning of our conversation about solidarity. For societies to work, you have to have a kind of consensus. You need support to have public investments in infrastructure, technology, education, the things that make our society function. We live in a very urban society. When you live in an urban society, you're constantly interacting with other people. You need water, you need sewage, you need roads. Again, if you don't have enough social solidarity, if you don't have enough cohesiveness, you're not going to be able to get the political support for those investments, those public investments that are so important. One of the reasons you can't get that support is that the people at the very top, they don't need public schools. They don't need public transportation. They have their helicopters or their, you don't need parks, you don't need all of those other public services. And they're afraid that if you have a government that is too strong, it will use its power to redistribute. But what they don't understand is they're being short-sighted, because the only sustainable and real prosperity is shared prosperity. So when you create a society with more cohesiveness and more equality, even the 1% benefits.
A gente tem uma experiência rica na Europa com as crises que ocorreram nos países, principalmente ibéricos, né, Portugal, Espanha e Grécia, né, onde o sentimento de mudança, principalmente na Grécia, foi muito forte. Imediatamente, setores da mídia europeia já começaram a dizer, na época, que a Grécia estava propondo calote, né, quando, na realidade, ela estava querendo uma reanálise da dívida que tinha sido feita com os bancos europeus, né, com o banco do euro. Eu pergunto ao senhor, qual o papel da mídia no sentido de preservar o poder e a riqueza na mão desse grupo, que hoje fica com a boa fatia do que o planeta produz?
Well, there are many aspects of your question. Let me take a couple of them. No, first, what is very clear is that the economic policies that the Troika, the IMF, the European Central Bank, the ECB, and the European Commission imposed on Greece and Portugal, the other countries, were a disaster. The result of it was depressions. You know, some American economists had said a few years ago that depressions are over, they're a thing of the past. And no longer after they said that we created a new depression. But it was created, it was not necessary. It was their extreme austerity that depressed the economy so much. And they had an election, and in Greece and in Portugal, they said, no way, this austerity is unacceptable. 62% in both countries voted against austerity. But what has happened in Europe is very troublesome because they're undermining democracy. In the case of Greece, after they voted, the Troika said, you don't get to choose your economic policy. You have to do what we tell you. If you're part of the Eurozone, you've given up your economic sovereignty. And economics is what everybody cares about. So to me, and in Portugal, you see something almost is just as bad, that the president refuses to install a coalition that had a majority of the votes. Because he says they're against the Eurozone, and I won't do it. So we see a real undermining of democratic processes in both of these.
A Europa como uma unidade, com uma moeda única, com esses países renunciando a uma parte da sua soberania, uma coisa de sobrevivência muito mais difícil do que a gente pensava 20 anos atrás. Porque um país, uma unidade que você precisa impor interesse, vamos falar assim, francamente, da Alemanha para Portugal, da Alemanha para a Grécia, da Alemanha para a Espanha. Você precisa impor interesses, que não são interesses nacionais. Será que isso sobrevive? Será que isso... Inclusive essa emergência fascista hoje na Europa, conhecemos na Europa movimentos fascistas, anti-União Europeia, que colocam uma questão que as pessoas estão começando a prestar atenção neles. Né?
Yeah. I'm very worried because basically what happened is the euro was a political project, but the solidarity wasn't strong enough to create the institutions that would make the euro work. So the result of it was they had an economic project, but economic integration outpaced the political integration. There wasn't enough of the solidarity that would work, and we now, since the euro created, seeing the consequences, which in my judgment have been an economic, but also a political disaster. So now they've lost their economic sovereignty, but that means that voters are going to get angry, and they've been getting angry. They're getting particularly angry at the parties who insist that we continue the same policies that have proven themselves wrong. So you're going to get extremist parties, particularly on the right, the fascist parties, and I think it's extraordinarily dangerous. Now, one of the other aspects that was very troubling to me, and it goes back to what you asked about, there's a lot of dishonesty going on and hypocrisy. So the IMF has been very clear. Greece debt has to be restructured. It can't repay the debt. You can't squeeze money out of where it's not. The principle of giving a company, a household, a country a fresh start is a basic principle of economics. The UN has basically endorsed this principle, but Germany refuses to recognize it. And so even after the IMF's analysis said you have to have a debt restructuring, Germany tried to keep that result secret, so it wasn't released before the referendum. And now they continue to say, we will not, Germany says they will not accept a debt restructuring, but we insist that IMF be part of the program. The IMF says we cannot be part of a program without debt restructuring. What will happen, I think, in the end is a kind of linguistic hypocrisy. They will have a debt reprofiling. You ask, what is the difference between a reprofile and a restructuring or a debt write-down? They're all the same thing. But the Germans don't want to admit that they are not going to be repaid. And they're not going to be repaid because of what Germany did to Greece. Because if Germany had created a program that would have allowed Greece to grow, then Greece could have repaid. But Germany effectively killed Greece, and now they have to pay the consequences because Greece cannot repay the money. All of this, to go back to the theme of the price of inequality, all of this is increasing inequality between the countries of Europe and within Europe.
Como o senhor viu a decisão do Alex Tsipras, que ele fez uma campanha pelo não, e quando ele encontrou-se lá com o muro, né, provavelmente ele apostava que a votação que ele teria, o referendo que ele teria, iria sensibilizar a Troika, né? Como isso não aconteceu, ele recuou imediatamente, né? Como que o senhor viu isso? O senhor achou que foi correto? Eu ouvi o senhor falando que o senhor achava que ele devia sair do euro do mesmo jeito. Eu queria que você explicasse um pouco, porque o senhor tem um ponto de vista interessante aí.
Yes, and I did go over to Greece, talk to him, talk to this finance minister, the new finance minister, to many Greek people. The Greeks were torn. They wanted two things that were both reasonable. They wanted to be a member of the Eurozone. They wanted to be part of the Euro, and they wanted the end to austerity. And there's no reason why you couldn't have both, except Germany said no. Germany says you have to choose. Either you accept depression, austerity that has led to this depression, 25% decline in GDP, 60% youth unemployment. More than 1 out of 2 young Greeks are out of a job. You either have to accept that depression or leave. The Greeks didn't know what to do, but in the end, they said, we have to stay in the euro. I'm not sure it was a right decision. I understood why the prime minister made that decision. He was reflecting the intensity of the feeling of the people of Greece. But what I would have done was to go to the Greek people and say, look, there are many countries in Europe that are very European. They're part of Europe. They're part of the European Union, but they're not part of the Eurozone. UK, Sweden, Denmark, they're just as European as Greece or anything else, but they didn't make a big mistake. They didn't join the euro. And this little piece of paper with some pictures on it, that's not being European. What being European is European values. What being European means what kind of social responsibility you have to other citizens, the notion of human rights. To me, the most important part of being a European is those European values. And what Germany was demanding, they give up on those values. Forget about the people who are suffering.
O senhor acha que o mundo está sofrendo com a falta de um contraponto? Quer dizer, o planeta ficou capitalista como um todo, mesmo os países que se dizem comunistas, como a China, né? E a própria Cuba, né? Tem um papel hoje dentro do sistema capitalista. Parece que as nações não têm um referencial de utopia, né? O senhor acha que falta essa utopia para a humanidade imaginar uma sociedade mais justa, mais igualitária?
So I think the critical thing is that the Cold War is over, the battle between communism and the market economy is over. Now we need to reframe the discussion. It's what kind of a society, what kind of an economy do we have? We know that our economy, for an economy to succeed, the market is going to have to be an important part. We're going to be a market economy. But we also know that every successful economy, the government plays an important role. Who made the investments in the United States in the internet? All the big innovations in America, it was the government that was the basis. And then the market brings it, firms bring it to the market, but it was the government who did the basic research. And so We have the government, we have the market, and we have a third. We have civil society. What's the strongest institutions in America? When everybody thinks about America, what do you think is the strongest? You think of our universities. They're neither for-profit or government. Harvard, Columbia, all of these are nonprofit foundations. And we forget about that. Those are an important part of our society. They're neither government nor market. They're sort of what I would call part of civil society. Very important. So what we need to do is think about how do we bring those three things together in balance. And if you get them out of balance, then you're going to wind up in a situation where the economy, society, doesn't function well. That's what happened in the United States before the crisis of 2008. We got out of balance. We went free markets unrestrained. And we all suffered as a result. And we still are suffering as a result. There are very many different kinds of market economies. Scandinavian countries have succeeded in getting the balance better. They've been growing more strongly, and every part of their society has been sharing in that prosperity. So that's one economic model. It's an alternative to the American model, and I think in many ways it's been working much more successfully for most of the citizens. I mean, if you're in the 1%, go to America. That's the best place to be, especially if you're in the top 1/10 of 1%. It's the best place. But if you're poor, it's not the best place to be born. Choose another country to be born. So there is an important discussion for Brazil and for all countries to have is what kind of society, what kind of balance between these three parts of our society that you want to achieve.
Nós vamos agora para rápido intervalo e voltamos em instantes com o professor Joseph Stiglitz, Prêmio Nobel de Economia. Estamos de volta para a nossa entrevista com o professor Joseph Stiglitz, que está no Brasil para uma série de conferências do movimento Fronteira do Pensamento. Professor, eu gostaria de lembrar um período que o senhor passou no Conselho de Assessores do presidente Bill Clinton, que deu início a um período de grande crescimento da economia americana. Naquele período, o governo de Bill Clinton acho que foi o melhor nível de crescimento que teve nos últimos anos, né? Qual que é o balanço que o senhor faz? Foi possível fazer um crescimento mais equilibrado? Foi um crescimento que já tem muitas distorções? Como é que o senhor avalia aquele período?
It was obviously a very good period, and we wish we could have growth like we had then. And I wish I could say that I was partly responsible. I think that one of the other aspects of that period was it was one of the few periods where inequality started to be reduced. And it was partly because of things we did, but partly because of other things going on in the world economy. Among the things that we did was we helped engineer the economy towards full employment. Let me emphasize how important that is, both for growth and equality, shared prosperity. Because when you start getting the unemployment rate down, you know, right now people are saying, oh, we should accept a 6% or a 5.5% or a 5% unemployment. But in my mind, if you can get the unemployment rate down very low, that creates pressures to raise wages at the bottom, and that helps the people who are in the bottom. And we've seen very clearly it was only in that period where the parts of our society that have been marginalized, African Americans and Hispanics, started to see their wages increase. And so that was part of the main reason that we had a reduction in inequality. Now, to be fair, while I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, we stopped some of the bad things from going on. After I left, even though it was under President Clinton, some mistakes were made. And there were, in my mind, one important set of mistakes, and that was the deregulation of the financial sector, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which was the law that separated commercial and investment banks, the law that said you can't regulate derivatives, those risky products that resulted in taxpayers paying $180 billion to bail out one company, AIG, unbelievable. That those were mistakes that were, I had been fighting that issue when I was chairman of the council. I said you should not.
Quando o senhor saiu, teve uma mudança importante, então. Uma guinada, porque o segundo mandato do Clinton é um mandato com outra orientação mesmo, né? Ele não é esse que o senhor falou aí, não.
Yeah. Well, actually, we had a debate inside the Clinton administration. Right. The Secretary of Treasury was in favor of repeal of Glass-Steagall. But as an economist, not as somebody from Wall Street. He came from Wall Street and he went back to Wall Street. I was viewing it from the point of view of the economy and our overall society, and I said this is not good for our economy, it's not good for our society, and I explained why that was, and I and others were able to stop it. But eventually the forces of deregulation got too big, and those changes were made, and we paid a very high price for that kind of financial sector deregulation. There was one more thing that happened, and that happened while I was still chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. I fought it, and that was a battle I lost. You win some, you lose some. That's politics, as you know. And that was the battle over lowering the tax rates on capital gains. Because our analysis at the Council of Economic Advisors was very clear. Lowering taxes on capital gains does not lead to more investment. If you tax speculation, lower rate, land speculation, you don't get more land. You just get more rich people. So the capital gains did not have a good incentive effect. In fact, it distorted incentives. It encouraged people to go into speculation. But it created a lot more inequality. And Clinton did lower the tax rate on capital gains, but then that problem got much worse under President Bush, where they lowered them a lot more. And that was part of the momentum towards greater inequality in America.
No Brasil, os ganhos de capital, os ganhos de dividendos não são taxados.
I think it's outrageous. In the United States, we are debating about creating what we call a fair tax system that says anybody's income, no matter, should be taxed in the same way. Why should you tax the income of a worker at a higher rate than somebody who's clipping coupons, who inherited the money from his parents, who speculated on real estate? Why do they get taxed at a lower rate than somebody who's working for a living? There's no justification for that. So our debate is, can we at least get rid of this distortion and this inequity? And when I hear countries like Brazil where they don't tax it at all, I just don't understand it.
O Brasil viveu grande momento, como o senhor viveu no governo Clinton. Nos últimos 12 anos, o país diminuiu a desigualdade social, houve uma grande inclusão, o desemprego caiu e o país era visto no mundo como o grande acontecimento. Inclusive, durante a crise econômica que afetou os Estados Unidos, o Brasil passou por ela tranquilamente. Agora, nós vivemos uma crise que a gente não sabe qual é a dimensão econômica e qual é a dimensão política. Acho que as duas coisas estão tirando o Brasil de um caminho que ele estava tomando. Qual o conselho, se o senhor pudesse dar um conselho à presidente Dilma, qual conselho o senhor daria a ela?
I think Brazil should be commended with the policies that you've undertaken over the last 20 years that began with Cardozo, continue with Lula, increasing education, increasing the Bolsa Família, fight against hunger. You are really an example of a fight against inequality that worked. And you see it in the statistics. And it's really very surprising that in a short period of time, you can see the magnitude of the reduction in inequality. So it's a real achievement. The real question is, how do you continue that? Now, you mentioned one of the reasons for your success was that you got down unemployment. And that was the same thing as part of our success. And what worries me right now is that you are pushing policies of austerity, government cutbacks, that almost surely will increase unemployment and increase inequality. Now, there's one aspect of the Brazilian economy that I think needs to be examined in detail, and that is your financial sector. You're an exception. And not one maybe that you should be proud of. You have some very good institutions that have earned the respect of people all over the world. BNDES is one of the premier development banks everywhere. It's being used as a model of what others can imitate. The new development bank among the BRICS, the AIIB, all of these are using the BNDES as a role model. But your other part of your financial sector, particularly your private part of your financial sector, has the highest real interest rates in the world. The interest rates are stifling your economy and killing your budget. And taking away money that could be used for growth, for attacking inequality, for attacking so many of your problems. Let me go back to put this in a historical perspective, if I can, back to the United States at the end of World War II. Back at that time, the United States debt-GDP ratio was 130%. Now, that's probably more than twice the level in Brazil. And most people around the world would say, that's a disaster. We didn't take it as a disaster. We said, we're going to make this sustainable not by cutting back on government investments, but by increasing government investments, making GDP grow. So if you get GDP to grow, debt GDP goes down. And so we used that, we said, free education to everybody who fought in the war. Not just for 2 years, not just for 4 years, but as much education as they were qualified. Not in the poorest schools, but in the best schools, the most expensive schools, in Harvard and Columbia, free. Because we wanted our economy to grow and we wanted to give opportunity to everybody. We created a national highway program that knitted the country together, like the railroads had done in the middle of the 19th century. We created a technology program to make sure that we were the most advanced technology in the world. So the point of this is we didn't cut back, we spent. But part of that success in getting that debt GDP ratio down is we lowered interest rates. We didn't allow the government to pay the kind of outrageous interest rates that your government is paying on its debt.
Num capitalismo que o senhor mesmo disse que $1 é voto, os bancos no Brasil têm poder tremendo pela sua força econômica. Os governos ficam muito reféns desse poder, inclusive por conta de Congresso que depende do dinheiro dessas empresas para eleger os seus representantes. Como a gente pode reverter esse quadro dentro de uma democracia capitalista?
Well, that's the big question, and this is the struggle everywhere. We had a big struggle in the United States to regulate the banks, to stop the excesses of their predatory lending, their exploitation. It was a big fight, and we got a lot of civil engagement, a lot of people, and I would say we got a strong bill. Dodd-Frank passed in 2010. There was a balance of power between 300 million, 350 million Americans and 10 banks. It was basically equal, but we got something very strong. If you look back in our history, and you have your history, but in our history, there were two periods in the past where corporate interest got out of control, where inequality got out of control. And in both of those instances, American voters rose up and said, we are still a democracy, still. And they went to the polls, and the Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century was followed by the progressive legislation, bipartisan, that antitrust, curtailing the power of the monopolies. It worked for a while. At the same time, after the roaring 20s that brought on the stock market crash, the Great Depression, we passed Glass-Steagall, we passed the Wagner Act, which gave bargaining rights to workers. We passed Social Security that protected the elderly. So we changed the face of America. Now, the point is that when there is enough voter outrage and to say, look, there is no reason that Brazil should be different from every other market economy, mixed economy. Why are interest rates here so high? Why does the government have to pay?
É que como o Brasil fez uma moratória nos anos 80, ele perdeu a confiança dos mercados e hoje ele sempre vai precisar, está condenado por anos e anos a pagar uma taxa de juros alta. É um dos argumentos que existe, que é a coisa da confiança.
I think it's a self-serving argument, and there are several ways of answering this. I mean, if you change the rules and regulations, you change the way the financial market operates. If I were to say what has undermined trust in America, it's our financial system that brought on the global financial crisis. After the crisis, money flowed back to the United States. Why was the money flowing to the United States? Was it because they had trust in our banking system? No. Our banking system had proved itself incompetent in managing risk. Its only strength was exploitation of ordinary people, predatory lending, subprime lending, things like that. So why was the money moving back to the United States? Because they had trust in our government. And they knew that our government would support our financial system. So the basic thing is that you have to change the rules that oversee the banks. So for instance, if you required the banks to take more of their deposits and keep them on reserve, and those reserves be lent to the government, that would lower the cost of debt to the Brazilian government. That's a simple change of rules. Most countries require the banking system to keep very large reserves at the Federal Reserve or the central bank, and those money are then lent to the government, and at very low or zero interest rates. So that's a way the government raises money at very low interest rates. So what I want to say is it's about how you structure the rules of the game.
Eu queria perguntar uma outra coisa. Há 8 anos que a taxa de juros nos Estados Unidos está 0,25%. Parada, quase zero, abaixo da inflação. Eu acho isso aqui uma coisa formidável, principalmente para a realidade brasileira. O senhor acha que permanentemente tem uma pressão de que agora a economia está boa e é hora de subir a taxa de juros? Ou seja, o mercado está querendo fazer subir. O senhor acha que vai dar para resistir por muito tempo? O senhor acha que esse período, essa taxa de juros baixa foi favorável? Como é que o senhor vê isso?
There are 2 points that I make. First, going back to Brazilian interest rates compared to American interest rates, the fact that Brazilian interest rates are so high puts your firms at a competitive disadvantage with those everywhere else in the world. that you've done actually remarkably well given the disadvantage that your financial market has put at you. But you should recognize that something is wrong with your financial markets that puts the rest of your whole economy at such a disadvantage. The only part of your financial market that is working, in some sense, are the development banks, like the BNDES.
Sou o grande admirador do BNDES. Por quê?
They're lending at reasonable interest rates. Now, some people say they're subsidized. They're not subsidized. They're normal interest rates. They're the interest rates that any normal economy would be facing. So I wouldn't call them subsidized. I would put it somewhat differently. You're putting a tax on every business in this country that has to go through the private banking system. They're paying a very high tax for this very high interest rates that the private sector charges, but it's a tax that doesn't go for public purpose. It goes to the banks. So this is clearly a distortion. And I think there needs to be a public discussion about why is Brazil have the highest interest rates? And when I say interest rates, this is true even of the real interest rates. And just to make it clear the nature of the comparison, the T-bill rate in the United States, adjusted for inflation, has been minus 2%. So we have negative real interest rates, and you have very high positive real interest rate. It's an unlevel playing field.
Taxas negativas, uma economia pode funcionar, né? E até está funcionando, a economia americana está até crescendo relativamente mais que a Europa com essas taxas negativas, né?
The negative rates have kept our economy from doing worse than it otherwise would. Going forward, I think the increase in the nominal interest rate from that very low number to a more normal number, I think it's going to happen very slowly. It's not going to happen overnight. And the reason is the American economy remains weak. And the reason the American economy remains weak is primarily due to two factors. One is our huge inequality means that there's a lack of demand. When you have so much money at the top and so little at the bottom, there's just going to be a lack of demand, and that weakens the economy. And the second one is the political. We have a mild form of austerity, much milder than in Europe and Greece and Spain and Portugal, but we have a mild form of austerity, and most people don't realize that. We have now something like 500,000 fewer public sector employees than we did before the crisis, and with a normal expansion of our economy, we would have about 2 million more public sector employees, so the gap is about 2.5 million. That's serious austerity hidden, but it's weakened our economy. And you see that weakness reflected in the wage increases. Wages are basically stagnant. And so this is part of the story of the enormous struggles that America's middle class are going through.
Bom, vocês têm uma diferença básica com a gente, que é a questão da fabricação do dinheiro que é usado no mundo. Ou seja, vocês produzem dinheiro. O Brasil não tem condições de produzir dinheiro para se alimentar e para financiar projetos públicos. Eu pergunto ao senhor, o setor privado, como fazem crer alguns capitalistas aqui no Brasil, é mais eficiente que o setor público?
I think parts of the public sector are extraordinarily efficient. Parts of the private sector are very efficient. And there are parts of both that are very inefficient. Let me give you some examples. No government agency, no government, has ever wasted money on the scale of America's private financial system. If you count the losses from our financial sector mismanagement in the years before the crisis and the consequences after the crisis, my calculations are we're talking about trillions of dollars, billions of dollars. So in terms of sheer waste, it's enormous. Another example of waste in our private sector. The OECD just came out with new data about life expectancy. There's been across the OECD an increase in life expectancy. People are living longer. But the United States has moved from towards the top of the advanced countries towards the bottom. And yet we're spending more than twice what any other country is spending. France spends 11% of GDP, and it's a lower GDP. We spend 17% of GDP. And yet life expectancy in France is much higher than in the United States. An enormously inefficient private healthcare sector that we have in the United States, a pharmaceutical industry that is very good in exploitation. If you come to the United States and you use your cell phone, you'll quickly discover that our telecom system is not as good as in India, say. So we have those kinds of sectors. On the government side, the National Park Service, Medicare, Social Security are all very efficient public sector services. The transaction cost of Social Security is a fraction of that of the private sector retirement programs. So my view is keep an open mind about it, case by case, and try to study why it is that the National Park Service, why it is that Medicare, Social Security are so efficient, and why it is that our financial system is so inefficient. And so when I say inefficient, it's very efficient in extracting money, but not very efficient in producing the kinds of services that lead to our economy to grow faster.
E essas migrações que estão vindo para o Brasil é benéfica para a economia brasileira, principalmente os africanos e haitianos que estão vindo para o Brasil?
Well, migration has become a global problem, and I view migration in part as a reflection of global inequities, global inequalities. You know, to go back to Europe, for instance, where there's the massive migration going on, some of that migration is a result of the war in Syria. A lot of the migration is caused by inequality of economic opportunity. It's economic migration. For instance, there were a lot of people from Albania and other Balkan countries living in Greece. But when the unemployment rate in Greece reaches 25%, 50% youth unemployment, they're leaving. Where are they going? They're trying to go to that part of Europe where there are jobs, and that's Germany. So a lot of that migration is economically induced, and it's related to our failure to create equalities across countries, just like we failed to create equalities within our countries.
Infelizmente, o nosso tempo acabou. Queria agradecer ao professor Joseph Stiglitz, queria agradecer ao professor Fernandes e queria agradecer especialmente a você que ficou nos assistindo. Na próxima terça-feira, às 11 da noite, para mais uma edição do Espaço Público. Até lá!